Awesome time, and it's been
Okay.
all right. So thank you. This has been really great, and the audiences have been great, and it's been fun to be here. So there's now an excellent literature on the meaning of sex crime panics in the 20th century U.S. Broadly, I'm on my tiptoes, for God's sake. Okay, there we go. Broadly, scholars argue that these incidents reflect deep-seated anxieties about changes in the gender and sexual order in the United States. However, we know very little about how the targets of these panics interpreted their characterization as sexual predators. We also don't know very much about how the myth of pedophilia shaped queer understandings of sexuality or how the myth structured claims for family and for civil rights. This paper comes out of a broader project that addresses queer relationship to families in the post-war US. And I do that broadly speaking. There is excellent work by Dan Rivers and by Heather Murray that deal with specific aspects of gay relationships to family, parents and children, or gay adult children. But my project is sort of looking at the ways in which ideas about the American family and experiences of LGBT people interact and overlap. And so given that there's such a fraught relationship between ideas about the American family and queers as pedophiles, I knew that I had to deal with this myth of pedophilia at some point in this project, and this paper represents my first sort of wrestling with this, because of course it casts such a long shadow over post-war gay life. In public policy, the myth's broadest implications and impact have been on issues of custody, obviously, but also I think on the teaching profession. However, as this paper will illustrate, it also shaped understandings of sexual identity and sparked conversations about sexuality in children and, of course, sexual ethics in the gay community. While it's probably unnecessary for this crowd, I just need to emphasize that statistically, queer people are not any more likely to sexually abuse children than anybody else. And actually, in fact, over 95% of people who abuse children are straight identified men. So let's just be clear there. But that doesn't mean that queers don't have to deal with the myth of pedophilia that has been directed at them. So first I'd like to speak a little bit about sort of big categories like race and class and gender, although in the interest of time I've had to cut some of that from this paper. And so my real interest in this next little discussion is about race. As Estelle Friedman notes in her work on the myth of pedophilia, the sex crime panics of the 1950s broadly targeted white middle-class men. And that was both a targeting in terms of actually people who were being arrested and charged and treated in certain ways by the courts, but also ideologically, right? So black men were not actually seen as sexual criminals, or they were seen as sexual criminals, but they weren't seen as sexual psychopaths, they were just criminals. And they were rapists, so this is part of that much longer tradition of characterizing African-American men's sexuality in that way. However, interestingly, I do find evidence for the myth of pedophilia in both black and Latino communities in the 50s, 60s, and 70s through the narratives of various interviews and oral histories and coming out narratives. One black man raised in the South related that as a child, his community identified a local black barber as gay. Quote, if being gay came up, he was always the person they pointed to. Identified as, quote, the town gay person, the children were, quote, told not to socialize with him so that we didn't get our hair cut at his barbershop, unquote. Another man stated that his family warned their children about, or their families warned children about certain men, but, quote, you didn't always know why, unquote. Interestingly, the black and Latino communities did not cast perpetrators as white outsiders, which is to say they identified other members of the community as dangerous to children. And perhaps in that way they were trading, so given the white presses tend to code homosexuals and pedophiles as white, and at times as outsiders, perhaps trading on earlier fears of unattached men as dangerous, a la Canaday, all fags or floaters, the way the myth traveled in communities of color is interesting and I think calls for more explanation. In addition to race, I also have some data and observations about gender, that is to say the ways in which both women and men are caught up in the myth of pedophilia, but also in some ways treated differently. And however, since I'm interested also in the gay community response, I've cut that section in favor of a discussion of the ways in which the myth of pedophilia interacted with gay discussions about cross-age relationships in the community. So please feel free to ask me questions about gender in the question and answer if you're interested. The most startling finding for me, though probably not for any of the research psychologists we might possibly have in the room, was the impact the myth had on gay identity formation in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And here I must pause to say that though I see gayness as a constructed category, I think that these accounts of the way that the myth impeded identity formation are still important. Gayness is not the only way to live in the world as a same-sex attracted person, but for the post-war period, it marks an acceptance of same-sex attraction as a legitimate way of being, having relationships, and for many, it marks the entrance into communities that provided support and comfort. In white accounts, both men and women recall extensive knowledge of the myth of pedophilia as children in the 60s and 70s, and report that and some of them report that the myth interfered with the development of their sexual identity. As Lisa Graveston wrote about her adolescence in the 1960s, she resisted her same-sex desires because, quote, "we were taught that homosexuals were rapists and child molesters." Ben Barr, who's a man I interviewed as part of my HIV project in Utah, grew up Jewish and gay in Salt Lake City, and he reported that his parents introduced him to the myth of pedophilia very early. They said, quote, "these are dangerous people, they should be locked up," unquote. After being bullied mercilessly in an elementary school for being a fag, his words, at age 13, Barr consciously chose to reject same-sex attraction and pursue heterosexuality. Quote, "I was really terrified that that's what it would mean I would be. So I remember very clearly thinking, I don't want to be a queer because queer means I'm going to hurt kids," unquote. The myth of pedophilia shaped people's understandings of their same-sex desires, casting long shadows over their self-esteem, identity development, and at times delaying their entrance into community. A young man responding to a survey conducted by Carla Jay and Alan Young in 1979 explained that he first learned about homosexuality from magazines like The Startling Detective. These narratives taught him that, quote, "I'd probably attack a child." In high school, he, quote, I thought I was going to have a nervous breakdown. I was very anxious to get out of town, so if I attacked a child, at least it wouldn't be a relative, especially either of my sister's children. His exposure to the myth through popular culture led him to view his emerging same-sex desires as a danger to children in his own family, children he cared about. His narrative also reinforces the idea that people could not embrace same-sex desire and remain in place. Alan Berube has argued broadly for homosexuality as an identity of movement, drawing on both his own work and on the broader implications raised by John D'Amelio's Capitalism and Gay Identity. Berube makes connections between homosexuality and motion, arguing that to express homosexual desires, people had to leave home, to move from small cities and intimate places to big and anonymous ones. Or as I say in Utah to my students, are you going to stay in Brigham City or are you going to go to Salt Lake? What are your choices here? You're going to go to Brigham City. You're gonna go to Salt Lake and Brigham City, which, by the way, is where my mother-in-law grew up. So Brigham City is always my favorite example of a place one probably wants to leave if one has same-sex desire. And while desire for partner and community impelled much of this movement, right? You leave the place that you're in because you need to find other people who you can explore this with. In this narrator's case, he fled both the myth and from himself. To him, staying in place and having same-sex desire proved too dangerous to family. So I think we need to think through what that movement, when it is a movement towards and when it is a movement away. Gays in the 1950s and 60s debated the implications of the stereotype and what they might do about it. And those of you who have worked through a lot of the Homophiles and maybe the Physique magazines, I don't know, that'd be great. Publications know that this is a sort of ongoing conversation in the latter, and in one Mattachine review, most expressed anger at the association. As one man stated, quote, "I can't tell you how sick I am of being portrayed as a child molester. The last thing I want to do is molest or, for that matter, convert a child." And as Dan Rivers' work has shown, and the work of lawyers like Krivlowski, right, this becomes a huge issue in custody battles. That sort of slippery slope between actually sexually abusing, but then also the idea of conversion, of teaching people to be gay. In a 1956 article, the author rejected the collapsing of the category of the sexual predator onto the homosexual, and here he's getting directly at what happens in these sex crime panics. Quote, "To the average person, the terms homosexual, pervert, degenerate, and sex fiend all mean the same thing. To them, as a confessed homosexual, I am a potential child molester, perhaps even a killer." He then went on to describe the various professions who benefited from the characterization of homosexuals and child molesters. So the police, the press, etc., politicians. Closing with parents, however, he shifted his analysis slightly, opening up room for a positive homosexual response. Quote, "To the average parent, I'm a menace to warn their children against. Never talk to strange men and never get into a car with anyone you don't know." Having established parents' fears about homosexuals in general, he went on, quote, "As for James down the street, always speak kindly to him, but don't ever be friendly with him. He can't help being what he is." That response, I think, opened up the possibility that knowing a homosexual could actually undermine stereotypes. Unknown homosexuals were all child molesters, but, quote, James down the street did not emerge as particularly threatening, just pathetic. The notion that children should be polite and, quote, speak kindly because he couldn't, quote, help who he was, actually highlights a possible path forward. If the known homosexual was just sad but not dangerous, then coming out to straights, as would become gay liberation's strategy after 1969, that could begin to disrupt these automatic associations between homosexuality and pedophilia. Gay liberation also obviously had an impact on gay responses to the myth. By the 1970s, some gay narrators and authors began to discuss the myth in the context of youth sexual autonomy and cross-age relationships. These conversations acknowledged a particular reality, that men of all sexual orientations, or some men of sexual orientations, find youth sexually attractive, and also that youth themselves have sexual desires that they sometimes aggressively pursue. First, it's interesting to me that queers even had this conversation, as straights, certainly to my knowledge, never did, right? I've never seen straight people debate this sort of idea of child sexual autonomy and what we as adults should do about that when faced with that. The willingness to even discuss these issues indicates the queer community's attempts to grapple both with the stereotype and with the reality of adolescent sexual feelings and autonomy. It also indicates an engagement with the question of what the relationships between queer youth and adults should be, and in that way is more meaningful and interesting than the broader American impulse to deny that children have sexual feelings at all. For those of us who have spent a lot of time raising children, I'm just here to tell you, children have sexual feelings. And this closing off of, I think, an important discussion about young people and sexuality is not only stupid, and here I'm channeling my years as an AIDS educator, but it is unhelpful from both a moral and a public policy standpoint. In contrast to straight refusals to talk about these issues, the gay community in the early 1970s engaged in a lively debate about it. The first author of a 1971 pamphlet, quote, A Gay Manifesto, addressed the myth by first arguing that, quote, as for child molesting, the overwhelming amount is done by straight guys to little girls. It is not particularly a gay problem, and it is caused by the frustrations resulting from anti-sex Puritanism. In this formulation, the author argues, in my opinion accurately, that child molestation is actually a straight male problem, and one rooted in attitudes that gay liberation actively sought to overturn. The solution to child sex abuse, then, was more rather than less discussion of sexuality. Tellingly, the author also noted that much of the cross-age sexuality visible in gay male communities and in cruising areas came from same-sex attracted adolescents' desires to explore their sexuality. As he argued, quote, kids are sexual beings way earlier than we would like to admit. He backed this up with his own experience, quote, those of us who began cruising in early adolescence know this, and we were doing the cruising, not being debauched by dirty old men, unquote. Oral histories and published coming out stories uphold this author's generalization that some same-sex attracted youth pursued sex aggressively with older people. Gay liberation, of course, could solve both of these, quote, problems. Destroying the anti-sex Puritanism would decrease the desire of adults for sex with children, and it would also allow a frank conversation with youth about sexual desire and autonomy. And many, many narrators, and again, those of you who work in these kinds of documents know this, many narrators describe seeking out older partners at an early age. Although actually, to be fair, this is gendered. It is male narrators who talk about this. Troy Perry, who would later go on to found the MCC Church, describes his first sexual encounter at age 9 with a 14-year-old neighbor. Quote, "I really dug him. I knew what I wanted. I wanted to go to bed with that boy. And I did. I was the aggressor." No, there's actually an exclamation point in the quote. Similarly, an African-American man reflecting on his crush on a 17-year-old stated that, quote, "It started as mutual exploration. There was something that was incredibly intoxicating about the experience." Arguments about recognizing sexual desire among youth, however, do not mean that gay men agreed with sexual cross-age relationships. Their criticisms of that practice revolved mostly around the youth's, quote, "unformed nature." As one man explained, he did not want to have sex with, quote, "a teenager whose identity was not fully formed." Another man remarked that, quote, "prepubescent kids and teenagers don't have any self-awareness," unquote. A third commented that, quote, "boys under the age of 14 have not developed emotional maturity and moral sophistication to make sound, reasonable judgments about what is sexually important to them, and I would not want to influence a person at that age towards a homosexual orientation," unquote. All of these men acknowledged that children had sexual feelings, but argue that these feelings had not yet coalesced into identity and therefore were fragile and needed to be left alone. They express a clear commitment to gay liberation's position that people should be free to explore and express their sexuality. I mean, you guys know this, but my students don't really, right? Gay liberation wasn't about making everybody gay, right? It was about saying everybody should explore their sexuality and come to their own conclusions. Cross-age relationships in these arguments and in these discussions violate the freedom to explore one's sexuality by imposing adult sexuality, sexual experiences, and sexual identity onto children. However, they do not, as the straight community tended to do, ignore sexuality as a component of children's experience. In that way, the gay community clearly debated the ethics of sex and sexual responsibility way before HIV/AIDS. Rather than shape the sexual identity of children, as I must point out, straights continue to do aggressively, particularly in places like Utah, where regularly there are reports of kids being sent into reparative therapy, still doing this. I think these men called for non-interference and an analysis and recognition of the profound power dynamics that shape sexuality of all kinds. These preliminary analyses on my part are part of a chapter on the myth of pedophilia and the shadow it has cast over many facets of gay life in the 20th century. While we have made some progress, it does remain a remarkably persistent myth, and I keep having to revise my plans for how I'm going to conclude the chapter. It has shifted from the brutal beating of a gay couple in Salt Lake City in 2008 who took in at midnight 2 kids of their neighbors who were sort of wandering around because their parents were partying. The parents found out where the kids went, they beat them. The gay couple was then actually initially arrested for kidnapping and sexual abuse, which did not happen, and then those charges were dropped and the family that beat them was eventually prosecuted for assault. For a while I was thinking I would do Dan Savage's It Gets Better project, where he makes an argument about the inability of gay adults to talk to gay youth because of the myth of pedophilia and the assumption that any kind of conversation is somehow going to be either sexual abuse or some kind of attempt at conversion. And of course, this is terribly fraught because of the enormously high rates of alcohol, drug abuse, and suicidal ideation and high-risk behavior among gay youth, right? So it matters that we can't talk to queer youth. So I was thinking I would do that. And then, of course, the recent laws concerning bathrooms, which have resuscitated this myth yet again, aimed more at trans people than queers more broadly. I would like to think that we're done with this myth, but queers as a threat to children, and by extension as a threat to the American family, have proved remarkably resilient and a very effective way to deny queer people both family and civil rights.
I'd just like to start off by saying what a privilege it is to be here. What a privilege it is to be on this fantastic panel, and consequently how scared I am, because I'm actually an 18th and 19th century historian, and this is my first dipping of my toe into the 20th century. So please forgive all of my errors. I blame them on my imaginary friend. Growing up in Greenwich Village in the 1940s, Jonathan Ned Katz lived at 81 Jane Street, downstairs from his unmarried aunt, Cecily Brownstone, the food editor for the AP from 1947 to 1986. Brownstone